Hello, everybody, and welcome to the PT on Ice Daily Show. My name is Christina Previtt. I am one of our pelvic faculty. We have two courses right now in our pelvic health division. We have our 8-week online course, and that goes from everything from the female athlete all the way into return to exercise postpartum. Our next 8-week online course is starting the beginning of March. So if you're interested in learning all things female athlete, I encourage you to jump in. And then we also have our 2-day live course where we teach the foundations of the supine and standing internal assessment. And then we go all the way, bridge that to pregnancy and postpartum modifications for pelvic floor dysfunction. No, studying pelvic anatomy is not very hard. It's just like any other part of the body. It's a set of muscles, and we are musculoskeletal experts. So, okay. Today, what I wanted to talk about is a trend that I've been seeing all over the social media spaces, and it is around exercising to your menstrual cycle. Jess, a couple weeks ago, did a really incredible job of doing some introductions to the menstrual cycle. I'm going to start building on what she laid down with that foundation, and then specifically go into some of the literature around exercise performance in different phases of the menstrual cycle. What that means is that we have to start with the phases of the menstrual cycle. Depending on where you are looking in the literature, which is why sometimes it can be confusing, the menstrual cycle can be broken up into 2, 3, or 4 phases, which sounds like it's really confusing, but really it's not. It just depends on what you're studying. The 2-phase model is the follicular phase and the luteal phase. So follicular phase, the first 14 days from menstruation being day 1 to the ovulation happening around, day 12 to 14. After ovulation, luteal phase starts until the end of the cycle. That's the 28 days, 2 phases, follicular, luteal. If we use a 3-phase model, it adds ovulation as this single event that is its own phase. So now the way that we would break that up is follicular phase, ovulation, luteal phase. And then finally, the 4-stage model, which is a kind of starting to become a little bit more common because people were using early and late follicular and it was just getting confusing, is menstruation, follicular phase, ovulation, luteal phase. And so what individuals are trying to do with those 4 phases is say, in order to sync to where you are at from a readiness perspective based on your sex hormones, we should be avoiding this in this phase or doing this in that phase. That is essentially what the messaging is for this type of social media content. And the one thing that I want to acknowledge is that we are starting to have more research on the influence of our cycling hormones on our performance and how individuals feel. And so we have data on how individuals are feeling during their menstrual cycle, what that means from objective performance measures. And then we have the whole other space, which is painful periods, dysmenorrhea, or other menstrual conditions. And so that is a whole other can of worms that we will tackle in another episode. So we're going to talk about for regularly menstruating individuals that do not have significant menstrual dysfunction. What's the data? And so what individuals are starting to say is that in late luteal, early follicular phases, as individuals are approaching their menstrual cycle, to really chill everything out. So just walk, do yoga, don't do any type of strenuous exercise. That is not what your body is primed to do. And then as you approach ovulation, you feel a little bit better and your hormones are at peaks, and therefore we should be performing more high intensity. So let's talk about the hormones in the different phases. Our estrogen, progesterone, and luteinizing hormones are the 3 hormones we're going to talk about. Jess brought up estrogen and progesterone, and I'm going to add in the luteinizing hormone piece. When we are menstruating, our estrogen and progesterone are at its lowest. Throughout the follicular phase, we're going to see an estrogen surge that estrogen surge is going to hit a critical threshold that's going to trigger the pituitary to release luteinizing hormone. That luteinizing hormone spike triggers ovulation to occur. Then there is a dip of estrogen, and then estrogen and progesterone increase together, though that second estrogen surge is not as big as the first one triggering ovulation. If fertilization occurs, those levels remain high. And then we start also releasing human chorionic gonadotropin, which gets picked up by a pregnancy test. If we do not get pregnant in the month, then it brings that down. And we start having that lower estrogen and progesterone that triggers menstruation from happening. We shed the thickening of the endometrium around the uterus that was going to be used to allow that follicle or that fertilized egg to implant. It did not happen, so everything shed. So that's number one. So the estrogen and progesterone surges are what this data is talking about, potentially feeling very different. When we look at the data, there are two really important things that we need to consider. One is what our objective measures say. And the second thing is what a female's perception of her performance are. And both of these things are really important. And the data says very different things when we start looking at this. So when I'm talking about objective data, it is things like your cortisol levels, your lactic acid accumulation, your time to exhaustion on a treadmill test, your max force development when you are doing a max squat in one phase versus the other. And in that objective data world, oftentimes we are comparing the follicular phase to the luteal phase with the hypothesis that people will feel better in the luteal phase post-ovulation than in the follicular phase in that early menstruation period. We have 3 systematic reviews that have been published in 2020 and 2021 that show that there is little to no statistically significant difference from objective measures for aerobic, mixed, and strength training alone for going to different parts of your cycle. So our objective data on 3 systematic reviews have shown very little difference from an objective perspective in hormone concentrations, time to exhaustion, and performance metrics on different phases of our menstrual cycle. That is important. From an athlete perspective, we do not choose when championships are or when races are based on if we are menstruating or not. And so that data is actually quite good, right? It's good that we don't have, these big swings in performance. On the other side of this coin, when we look at a female's perception consistently, many active individuals will describe feeling worse during the late luteal, early follicular phase, so that premenstrual and menstrual part of their cycle. And they will report feeling better, stronger, faster around ovulation. That matters, right? And what we see in some of that that subjective data is that individuals who have higher rates of dysmenorrhea or painful periods and heavier bleeds are going to perceive that they are feeling worse during that period. And it's not perception. They just feel worse because they are symptomatic around a specific phase of their cycle. And that matters. How you feel subjectively is going to translate into how you perform. But when we look at objective measures, what we see is that there is very little difference between the follicular phase and the luteal phase. So what does that mean? And let's kind of bring this full circle into what we can clinically take from this. Number one, we do not need to just be doing yoga for 2 weeks out of our cycle. And from a performance perspective, taking 2 weeks off of strength training for every 4 weeks is never going to get you stronger. Not running for 2 out of 4 weeks of your menstrual cycle is never going to make you faster. If you are a person who is very sensitive to your menstrual cycle, on the other side of the coin, and you are exercising for health, and you are choosing that this is something you like to do in this part of your cycle and this is what you like to do in the other part of your cycle, that's cool, right? I think that's great. Like if you are choosing the things you love to do and moving in a variety of ways for health, that's wonderful. But this messaging that we are somehow less than or less capable than in different phases of our menstrual cycle, I I can't get behind that messaging, because as athletes, we have so many barriers in the female space. To say that we need special considerations for our menstrual cycle, um, that is asymptomatic, would potentially work against us. If you have painful periods, setting up policies around menstrual health, putting in education around the menstrual cycle and when the menstrual cycle is painful, when there are physical conditions, when individuals are amenorrheic and not having their menstrual cycle, is so important right now in the coaching space. But sometimes the messaging of saying that you only need to do, or you should only be doing Pilates and walking, which isn't hitting a clinically relevant threshold for fitness in certain weeks of our cycle, I think can be harmful. And so when we're thinking about this data, how do we approach this clinically? What I ask any of my athletes that I am working with is, do you notice any differences in your performance at different aspects of your cycle? How do you feel? And I make it very open, right? Because I don't want to be leading or probing. And what I will show is, if my clients are very sensitive, then I will make changes or allowances for that, or create education around the fact that you may feel more fatigued around this part of your cycle. From there, if I have a client who says that they feel really good in their ovulatory phase, they feel really crummy in their menstrual phase, then from their programming perspective, you give them buffer windows. So if they're feeling really good and they're supposed to hit a squat at 100 pounds, then you can say you can go from 100 pounds to 110 if you're feeling really good that day. For your menstrual cycle, if you're feeling crummy, then again, give an RPE, give a rate of perceived exertion. If you're doing 100 pounds, give them a buffer window between 85 and 105 and let them choose in between that window. That is not me saying that I should be avoiding that activity altogether. If you have painful periods and it is excruciating for you to function, when we have individuals with premenstrual syndromes and premenstrual dysphoric disorders, which is a um, a diagnosis rather in the DSM-4 mental health manual, like it is significant. That is a whole different story. But for individuals who are regularly cycling, those would be the buoys and buffers that I would be using. Somebody asked, is it possible to sync your cycle with an event, like peaking or wanting to feel strong at the time of the event? So you couldn't actually move when you are ovulating or when you're menstruating, which is kind of the changes in your hormone cycle. Some people will use oral contraceptives to try and keep that a little bit more steady, especially if they feel a big low when they are menstruating. But we can't exactly change it. What we can do for some recreational athletes, especially those who are sensitive in their menstrual cycle, is to pick events that are not in that window when they are in that late luteal phase, early follicular phase, and allow them to pick events that is going to set them up for success. Just avoiding kind of that 5 days or 6 days of time, because usually what happens is the 3 or 4 days before a person's menstrual cycle and the first 2 days of their menstrual cycle is when they feel the most symptomatic, and then we can just kind of avoid those 5 days. All right, so let's kind of bring this full circle. Number one, the 4 phases of our menstrual cycle that are now more commonly used in the literature: menstruation, follicular phase, ovulation, luteal phase. From an objective perspective, we do not have strong enough data to support changing our exercise routine in any way because of the different phases of our menstrual cycle if we are a regularly cycling individual with no painful menstrual dysfunction or disorder that would prevent us from participating in our sport. The right now social media content around moving to your cycle, and they're saying that it's evidence informed, is not true. It's data picking. We do have some data that says there's a difference, and then for every study that says there's a difference, there's another study that says there isn't, which is why we have 3 syntheses that show that the differences are potentially negligible, and cannot confirm that there is a clinically relevant difference. Maybe this will change in the future. I do not know. This is still a new area of study, but we do have 3 systematic reviews that, as of right now, this is what it is demonstrating. For individuals who are sensitive, we know that a lot of athletes will self-report. So their subjective data show that they feel worse from a performance perspective, or things feel harder, like heavy legs, fatigue, just slowness to move around during the late follicular phase, premenstrual into the menstrual cycle, into menses rather, and then feel better around that ovulatory window between days 12 and 14. We can give them buffers and buoys, educate on where their hormones are at, and try and make recommendations to allow them to modify their training volume or load in order for them to feel successful and feel like they are meeting their body where they feel subjectively they are at. I hope you all found that helpful. I try not to go too much on a soapbox about this. This is something that I've been seeing a lot. And of course, I had to dive into the research on it. If you have any other questions, what we can see is this optimization of performance. If we can get individuals who are feeling really strong around ovulation and we can get them in that event on that day, that could be great because they're feeling a little bit stronger. But we do not need to be modifying everything around our exercise program for individuals who don't have painful period conditions. All right. If you have any other questions, let me know. A lot of this research we are putting into our newsletter because it is oftentimes evolving and emerging. So if anything new comes out in this space, it is going to be in our PPP on Ice newsletter. That's an email that comes out that is research focused every 2 weeks on Thursday. We just put out our last one last Thursday, so we have a week and a half until our next one comes out. If you are interested in grabbing that newsletter, you can go to ptonice.com/resources. It is absolutely free. Otherwise, I hope you all have a wonderful Monday, and we will talk to you soon.